After a decade in banking and finance, in 2010, I decided to do a tree change and join my then-in-law's citrus farming operation based in southeast Queensland. The following year, the Rudd-Gillard governments imposed a ban on live meat exports to Indonesia due to concerns around animal welfare. What wasn't common knowledge, though, was that Indonesia responded with restrictions on other Australian imports such as citrus. So there we were, a month out from harvesting approximately 100 shipping containers full of mandarins that were destined to Indonesia. We all of a sudden had no market for that fruit. That's me on the forklift about to load fruit into a shipping container. And the issue we had was that if we dumped this fruit onto the local market, it would have crashed prices domestically for growers. So we were faced with having to find a home for effectively enough fruit to fill the MCG. That was my real world experience of the importance of trade relations, and suffice to say, the following snip really resonates with me after that experience.
Dear friends, good afternoon.
Once it was cuddly, then Canberra's relations with Beijing turned frosty. Now there's hope of a breakthrough. But for years, Chinese investors have been pulling their cash from these shores.
Chinese tech company Huawei says Australian consumers will be worse off without its involvement in the 5G network rollout.
And calls for an investigation into the origins of COVID-19 have pushed the trade tensions to the edge. Money flowing out of China has been restricted, and it's becoming harder for foreigners to invest in Australia.
The decline really has now gone to a level where there is literally none or very little investment coming from China.
I thought that would be a really good way to set the scene for what's transpired in recent history, and also wanted to discuss how Australia got to this place with the People's Republic of China and what's shaped that relationship. So I'm going to look at a few major points along the way, not only the commencement of good trade relations between us and the PRC, but also how quickly they unravelled and what it took to get them back on track. There are four major issues impacting trade: state protectionism, poor diplomacy, trade policies, and resource capacity versus consumption capacity. So the quick background is that in the 1970s, when Gough Whitlam visited China as opposition leader, and then once he came into office, he followed up with his trade minister, Jim Cairns, and they set up a set of ground rules known as this communique in the slide here. And some of those ground rules have been challenged as China's dominance has grown, and certainly not least of which the fact that Australia previously, in the second paragraph highlighted here, acknowledged the PRC's claim over Taiwan. So as the geopolitical issues have changed since that time, there's certainly been tension gathering. I thought that putting a timeline in place would really help demonstrate what's going on in recent history. And it was really the 1980s and 1990s that Australia started exporting large quantities of wheat, wool, iron ore, and coal to China. And by 2001, China had actually joined the WTO and began its industrial boom with high demand for Australia's iron ore and coal and gas to develop itself as a nation. So by 2015, Tony Abbott struck a deal of free trade agreement with a number of Australian commodities on that list. And things started to sour, I suppose, in 2017, 2018, when Scott Morrison introduced a ban on Huawei from participating in the setup of Australia's 5G networks. And that was under the guise of security concerns, which were quite valid at the time. So by 2020, the final nail in the coffin occurred when the Morrison government called for an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. China responded pretty heftily with coercive trade actions, and Australian producers needed to find new export markets similar to the one I described we had with Indonesia. So it wasn't until 2022 when Anthony Albanese reset diplomatic relations with Penny Wong as his trade minister and recovered dialogue with the PRC. The PRC lifted restrictions, and most of the previous trade terms have resumed since. But it is worth noting that whilst China relaxed its overt trade restrictions with Australia since the incumbent government took office, it's probably worth not forgetting that whilst critics of the erstwhile government say that they mismanaged the relationship, it's clear that China really dictated the terms of trade, and the Australian producers suffered due to nothing else but geopolitical issues. It wasn't due to quality or capacity problems to provide what was promised. It was simply just political issues that put a stop to trade. Concerningly, the PRC ostensibly suggested that some of the restrictions, as the one put on wine exports, was due to Australia dumping cheap wine into the PRC. That simply wasn't the truth. After the PRC put restrictions on barley, wine, beef, lobsters and timber from Australia, these industries had to find new markets or reduce production to remain profitable and work through the crisis. In a powerful speech by Canada's PM, Mark Carney, recently, he very accurately described the current state of affairs with the rules-based order around the world, and the fact that the greatest powers of the world have essentially exempted themselves when convenient and enforced them when it benefits them. So whilst we need China to be in the mix when it comes to Australia's trading partners, it's axiomatic that having such a large trading partner comes with concentration risk that we really can't accept. If these industries here haven't learned from the trade restrictions from the PRC, the government should consider intervening between private enterprise and setting some regulatory limits to the total exports by maybe percentage of overall production. And not only to China, but any single country. Furthermore, we should consider contagion risks by way of association to other powers so that effectively we can't be locked out of trade just to affiliation with another country. And that's been recently seen by Trump's tariffs imposed on some countries in the EU just because they showed support of Greenland not to be sold or taken over by the US. So Australia needs to decide whether we want business at all costs or business on our own terms. And given we've got a position of good middle power, but some of the greatest power when it comes to energy, critical minerals, and food and fibre production, I think we can be a bit choosy. And choosing trading partners that have manufacturing ability is something I would suggest that the government needs to consider and pursue, because production capacity needs to be spread over multiple trading partners, not just relying on China for cheap manufacturing. An interesting book that I recently read was Apple in China and the Capture of the World's Greatest Company by Patrick McGee. And that really highlighted and demonstrated the danger of having all your eggs in one basket when it comes to this. I think we should look for countries with similar influence in the developed world or developed nations with similar values that have production capacity to fill our gaps. So that no one considers this politically biased with what I've just gone over, I've chosen a couple of short examples on how our political leaders from both sides of the political divide have been able to manage trade relations and communications in a constructive manner. We need politicians to not only find countries that complement Australia's trade capacity, but also de-escalate issues that would never lead to any productive outcome. Certainly not making public statements about how the drums of war are beating. We live in an era where soft diplomacy is required. I think it's worth pointing out that for a successful trading relationship, Australia needs to consider not only strengths and benefits that it brings to the trading partners, but understand those factors don't always outweigh the perceived or actual influence of our society, politics, or our ethical standards. Political leaders, people in business, and stakeholders within the trade environment need to recognise that even though our two countries may have fundamentally different views on certain topics, including the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, there's still an important balance and measured approach required when it comes to globalised trade. I wanted to highlight how relations rarely actually sour due to poor relationships between the buyers and sellers in globalisation and trade. And as I found in my tree change years on the farm, as in Indonesian customers still wanted our fruit, but diplomatic relations put a big wedge between us. So whilst Australia has an extraordinary capacity to grow and produce food and fibre for an affordable and sustainable way, we already produce well in excess of our own capacity to consume it all. So Australia produces enough food and fibre to feed about 121 million people. Yet we've only got 25 million people here. Therefore, we need to understand that not only do our trading partners need us, but we need them equally to keep growing and prospering economically. Thank you for watching.